In the winter of 1943, the road from Algiers to the Tunisian front was a graveyard of steel and silence. Convoys stretched for miles, trucks groaning under the weight of food, ammunition, fuel, and hope. Every few hundred yards, the twisted carcass of another vehicle lay smoking in the dust, testament to a war that punished not only those who fought on the front lines, but those who kept them alive. The German Luftwaffe ruled the skies over North Africa, and every supply run was a gamble against death. Drivers called it the gauntlet 150 miles of open road where ambushes, strafing runs, and mechanical failures claimed more lives than many frontline assaults. Supplies vanished into the desert faster than they could be replaced. It wasn't bravery that kept the convoys moving. It was desperation. Among those drivers was a wiry man from Kansas named Walter "Red" Henderson. He wasn't a soldier by trade. Before the war, he'd been a long-haul trucker hauling grain from Wichita to Galveston. He had a reputation for impossible deliveries, threading his rig through flood plains and winter storms that would stop most men cold. When he enlisted in '42, the Army didn't know what to do with him. Too old for combat, too stubborn for orders, too valuable behind a wheel. They gave him a uniform, a truck, and a mission: keep the front supplied no matter what. The convoys of '43 were built on rigidity. Military doctrine dictated that trucks moved in tight formation, 15 yards apart with the same spacing and speed maintained throughout. It was textbook logistics, perfect on paper, disastrous in practice. One bomb, one mine, one broken axle could bring the entire column to a standstill. Luftwaffe pilots called them rolling targets. A single strafing run could turn 40 vehicles into fireballs in less than a minute. Commanders blamed luck. Drivers blamed the system. Henderson just watched, jaw clenched, as good men died for the sake of neat lines on a map. The desert was unforgiving. Daytime temperatures soared past 120 degrees, melting the tar from the roads. At night, the cold bit down hard, freezing fuel lines and hands alike. Dust caked every moving part, turning engines into coffins. But worse than the elements were the enemy eyes. The Germans had spotters along the radioing convoy movements to the airfields at. Within minutes, the whine of engines would rise over the horizon. The first truck would explode in a flash of orange and black, and then panic would ripple through the column like wildfire. Drivers swerved, collided, jackknifed. The rest tried to scatter, but the tight formation turned chaos into catastrophe. By dawn, what was meant to feed an army had become just another column of smoke curling into the North African sky. Henderson had seen it all before, not in war but on America's roads, where blizzards and mudslides demanded improvisation, not obedience. He'd learned that the difference between survival and ruin often came down to instinct, not instruction. Watching convoy after convoy get shredded, he began to notice a pattern. The ones that survived longest were never the ones following orders to the letter. They were the ones who broke them. The drivers who varied their spacing, who shifted routes, who trusted their gut. It wasn't discipline that saved them. It was freedom. He started small. On one supply run, Henderson deliberately fell back from the convoy by half a mile. When Luftwaffe fighters swooped in and shredded the main column, his truck, trailing in the dust, went unnoticed. He rolled up hours later, cargo intact. No one paid much attention at first. Survivors chalked it up to luck. But Henderson didn't believe in luck. He believed in systems, and when a system was broken, it needed to be rebuilt. By spring of '43, Allied command was desperate. Nearly a third of supply shipments were being destroyed before reaching the front. Food shortages were rampant. Fuel reserves were dangerously low. Infantrymen joked grimly that their stomachs were fighting their own war. In that climate, Henderson's unorthodox success started to attract notice. His unit, nicknamed the Stray Dogs for their tendency to drift from formation, had somehow maintained a near-perfect delivery record. Not one major loss in over 3 months. When questioned, Henderson's explanation was as blunt as the man himself. "We drive smart, not straight." Word reached Colonel Harold T., head of logistics for II Corps. Was a career officer, all starch and regulation, the kind of man who measured efficiency in spreadsheets, not survival. He summoned Henderson to headquarters in Algiers, intending to reprimand him for reckless deviation from convoy protocol. Henderson arrived covered in dust and diesel fumes, his uniform a suggestion rather than a standard. Immaculate in his pressed khakis, regarded him like an untrained animal. The conversation that followed would later be described by witnesses as a standoff between the rule book and the road. Lectured on order and predictability, Henderson countered with numbers. He laid out a map and pointed to the dead zones where convoys had been obliterated, then traced the routes he'd chosen instead. zigzagging paths that hugged dunes, skirted wadis, and used the natural landscape as cover. He explained how he'd staggered his trucks at irregular intervals, altered speeds without warning, and traveled mostly at dusk or dawn to exploit the low visibility. It was madness, thought, pure, undisciplined madness. But then Henderson showed him the records. 3 months, 26 convoys, 0 losses. Something shifted. Wasn't a fool. He knew that innovation often came from the fringes, from men like Henderson who saw patterns others couldn't. Against his instincts, and the manuals stacked on his desk, he gave the trucker provisional authority to form a test unit. Officially, it was designated Experimental Convoy Procedure Unit 47. Unofficially, everyone just called it Red Circus. Henderson's approach was simple but revolutionary. He treated convoys not as rigid chains but as fluid organisms, living, adapting entities that could confuse and outmaneuver the enemy. Each truck in his unit operated semi-independently, communicating through light signals and improvised code. Spacing was irregular, sometimes 200 yards, sometimes 2 miles. Routes were chosen based on terrain, weather, and intuition, not a pre-approved map. He trained his men to think like hunters, not herded animals, to expect chaos and use it to their advantage. At first, the old guard laughed. To them, Henderson's method looked like anarchy disguised as strategy, but then came the field test. In May 1943, with the campaign for Tunisia reaching its final phase, Allied command needed to deliver a massive shipment of fuel to the front at pass. The route was a nightmare, narrow passes, exposed ridges, and frequent Luftwaffe patrols. Traditional convoys had failed repeatedly, gave Henderson the mission. The convoy rolled out under a bruised dawn. 30 trucks, each separated by unpredictable intervals, moving in near silence across the desert. They used sand trails instead of main roads, cresting dunes where visibility was low but cover was high. When the Luftwaffe spotted them at midday, the pilots were confused. There was no line to attack, only scattered movement, dust plumes drifting like mirages. Bombs fell wide. Machine gun bursts tore into empty sand. By the time the Germans regrouped, the trucks had vanished into a maze of ravines. 3 days later, every drop of fuel arrived intact at. For the first time in months, the front was without a single casualty. Commanders were stunned. Henderson just shrugged. To him, it wasn't magic, it was common sense. But word traveled fast. Soon, Red Circus became legend among the ranks, a story told in mess tents and foxholes. Drivers started adopting his methods unofficially, breaking formation, staggering their runs, trusting their instincts. Losses across North Africa plummeted. By autumn, zone reports showed an astonishing figure. Convoy attrition had dropped by nearly 90%. The transformation didn't happen overnight, nor without resistance. To the military establishment, Henderson represented a dangerous precedent, a civilian trucker outthinking the war machine. Yet the results were undeniable. The roads that had once been corridors of death were now arteries of survival. In the broader theater of war, it was a small revolution. But to the men who drove those dusty miles, it was salvation. Henderson never saw himself as a hero. He was a mechanic of movement, a man who understood that victory often depends not on who fires the most bullets, but on who keeps the engines running. And in that desert of dust and flame, one trucker's ridiculous convoy method had changed the rhythm of war itself. By the summer of 1943, the men of Red Circus had become something more than a logistics unit. They were a brotherhood of wanderers, mechanics, farmers, truckers, and a few ex-convicts who had traded the open highways of America for the endless dunes of North Africa. To outsiders, they looked like misfits. Shirts unbuttoned, helmets dented, trucks painted in mismatched camouflage scrawled with nicknames like Dust Devil and Sweet Lorraine. But among them was a unity that no regulation could replicate. They didn't march in step. They moved with rhythm, the rhythm of engines, of instinct, of survival. Their days began before sunrise. The desert was always coldest just before the light came, a silence so heavy you could hear the metal cooling on your truck's hood. Henderson would walk the line, boots crunching over sand and stone, cigarette glowing faintly in the pre-dawn dark. He never barked orders. He spoke softly, almost conversationally, because every man there already knew what needed to be done. That was his secret. He treated his drivers not as subordinates, but as equals. He'd tell them, "You know your machine better than I do. You know the road better than the map. Trust that." When the sun crested the horizon, the desert came alive. Heat shimmered in invisible waves, the sand turning to gold and glass. Engines coughed awake, belching black smoke that hung low before the wind carried it away. The men wore goggles and scarves, their skin already blistered from months of exposure. Once they rolled out, the convoy dissolved into organized chaos, trucks moving at unpredictable speeds, some cutting across dunes, others hugging wadis and dry riverbeds. From above, it must have looked like madness, a scatter of dust trails moving in every direction. But it was methodical madness, choreographed down to instinct. The Luftwaffe hated them for it. Pilots had grown accustomed to easy kills, straight lines of vehicles they could mow down with precision. Now they faced ghosts. Red Circus convoys were erratic, unpredictable, impossible to pin down. By the time they spotted one truck, the others were gone, hidden by terrain or sandstorms deliberately stirred up by the leading vehicles. Reports from German intelligence described them in frustrated tones. Enemy transport formations exhibit irregular behavior, impossible to anticipate movement patterns. Back at the Allied headquarters in Algiers, Colonel read those intercepted reports with a growing sense of vindication. The same maverick he'd almost court-martialed was now rewriting the book on supply warfare, for it was both triumph and torment. Henderson's success had forced a reckoning within the logistics corps, one that pitted tradition against adaptation. Some officers, bound to their manuals, insisted that the Circus's methods were unsustainable, dependent on one man's intuition. Others saw in it the blueprint for the future. But Red himself wasn't thinking about blueprints. His world was the road, the dust, the sound of tires grinding through gravel, the taste of sand that never seemed to leave his mouth. Every mission carried the same tension, a fragile thread between silence and sudden violence. They knew that each journey might be their last, yet they laughed, they cursed, they sang through the static of their radios. There was defiance in it, a kind of grim joy that only those living on borrowed time could understand. One of the Circus's youngest drivers, Private Joe, kept a small journal tucked behind the dash of his GMC CCKW truck. In one entry dated June 2, he wrote, "The road eats men alive, but Red makes it feel like we're the ones doing the eating." Another note scrawled in haste, "We ran empty today just to draw fire. Lost one tire, saved a whole column. Red says a truck, only as valuable as the lives it keeps moving." The unit became known for impossible rescues. Once near the El Salt Flats, a British convoy broke down after a mechanical failure. Enemy patrols were closing fast, and evacuation seemed impossible. Henderson's men rolled in without orders, engines roaring through a wall of sand and smoke. They fixed what they could, towed what they couldn't, and drove out under enemy fire, hauling 36 stranded soldiers to safety. When a British officer later tried to thank him formally, Henderson just shrugged. "You'd have done the same," he said. He was wrong about that, of course. Most wouldn't have dared. By mid-1943, as the Allies closed in on Tunis and began to crumble, the Circus had become a logistical lifeline. Supplies once trickling to the front now surged. The effect rippled outward. Tank crews had fuel, gunners had shells, medics had morphine. The battlefield began to tilt. In the words of one field commander, "We started winning not because we were better armed, but because we were finally fed." Yet even as their success grew, Henderson knew it couldn't last forever. War had a way of crushing individuality. What began as a small, scrappy experiment was now drawing bureaucratic eyes. Orders came down from Allied command to standardize the Henderson procedure. Manuals were drafted, diagrams made, men who'd never driven a truck in the desert were now trying to codify chaos. Henderson watched it all with a wary silence. He understood what they didn't, that his system wasn't a system at all. It was a mindset, a rhythm, a trust that couldn't be captured on paper. The turning point came one blistering afternoon in August. The Circus was tasked with delivering ammunition to the 34th Infantry Division near the line. Intelligence had warned of increased Luftwaffe patrols, but Henderson insisted on proceeding. The convoy rolled out at dusk, hugging the edge of a dry riverbed to avoid detection. The first hours were smooth, the only sounds the hum of engines and the whisper of sand beneath tires. Then just past midnight, the darkness erupted. Tracer fire streaked across the sky like molten comets. German dive bombers, Stukas, swooped in low, their sirens screaming, the infamous Jericho trumpets that turned every attack into a symphony of terror. Explosions tore open the earth. Trucks scattered, engines roaring as drivers veered off-road, some vanishing into gullies, others plowing straight through walls of flame. Henderson's radio crackled with fragments, screams, coordinates, curses drowned in static. He didn't hesitate. He swung his truck around, headlights off, and charged straight toward the chaos. Over the din, he shouted orders to break formation, to keep moving no matter what. When one truck overturned, spilling crates of ammunition into the sand, Henderson stopped against every instinct to help. With 2 men, he lifted the cases back onto a flatbed, the air around them thick with smoke and shrapnel. The others circled back to cover them, engines revving to kick up sand and obscure the target. It worked. The bombers overshot, blinded by their own fury. By dawn, the convoy emerged battered but intact. They'd lost 2 trucks but saved 18, and every round of ammunition reached the front. Soldiers had cheered when the circus rolled in, faces blackened with soot, uniforms in tatters. One British corporal saluted them, murmuring, "Bloody lunatics." Henderson just grinned. That's how we like it. That mission cemented their legend, but also sealed their fate. The upper brass couldn't ignore results, but neither could they tolerate insubordination. The more glory the circus earned, the more scrutiny followed. Commanders began sending observers, clipboard officers who tried to monitor compliance. The men hated them instantly. They were strangers to the dust, the heat, the fear. Henderson tolerated them, but barely. He knew something fundamental was changing, not just in the war, but in himself. What began as rebellion had become responsibility. The more he succeeded, the less control he had over what his creation became. Yet for that fleeting season in the desert, Red Circus remained untamed, a moving symbol of ingenuity under fire. They weren't just delivering supplies anymore. They were proving that survival could be engineered through imagination. The road had taught Henderson that freedom, even in war, was the ultimate weapon. And as autumn drew near, whispers began to spread across the front. The circus was being reassigned. A new campaign loomed across the sea in a place called Sicily. The road, it seemed, was far from over. The sea crossing from North Africa to Sicily was short, but for the men of Red Circus, it felt like leaving one war behind only to step into another. They'd grown used to the sand, the emptiness, the predictable cruelty of the desert. The Mediterranean was different, alive, unpredictable, shifting like the wind. In July 1943, as Operation Husky began, the horizon burned with the light of invasion. Allied ships packed the water from Tunisia to Malta, forming the largest amphibious assault since Gallipoli. Thousands of men, tanks, and trucks surged toward the island that Churchill had once called the soft underbelly of Europe. But there was nothing soft about Sicily. Henderson stood on the deck of a cargo ship, cigarette clamped between his teeth, watching the coastline come into view. The sound of distant bombardment rolled across the waves, heavy and continuous, like the world itself was cracking open. Behind him, his drivers leaned against the rails, silent, eyes fixed on the shoreline where tracer rounds flared like fireflies. Each of them had survived the desert. Now they were about to trade sand for stone, heat for humidity, and empty horizons for mountains that hid the enemy like shadows in a forest. The invasion was chaos wrapped in confusion. Even before the circus landed, they could hear reports of paratroopers scattered miles off course, gliders crashing into the sea, and beachheads jammed with stalled equipment. Henderson's unit hit the shore 2 days after the first wave. The beaches had still smelled of cordite and smoke. The sand was littered with wreckage, twisted landing craft, burned-out jeeps, helmets half buried like grave markers. The circus rolled out cautiously, engines humming over the low groan of the wounded being evacuated to ships offshore. Their mission was clear: keep 7th Army supplied as it carved its way up the western half of the island. But Sicily was unlike anything they'd faced before. The roads were narrow and ancient, winding through steep ridges where one wrong turn could send a truck tumbling into the abyss. The villages were dense, their streets barely wide enough for a single vehicle, and unlike the open desert, there was nowhere to hide from air attack. The Luftwaffe hadn't been defeated, only driven north. Their airfields in mainland Italy gave them reach, and their pilots, furious over the loss of North Africa, struck with precision. The convoys became moving targets again, but Henderson had learned too much to go back to the old ways. He adapted again. In the desert, the circus had used the terrain's emptiness as a weapon. In Sicily, Henderson turned its complexity to his advantage. He split his unit into micro-convoys of 4 or 5 trucks each, scattered across multiple routes. Some hugged the coast, others threaded mountain passes, some even moved at night without lights, guided only by starlight and instinct. Local civilians, some sympathetic, some suspicious, watched from doorways as the trucks rolled by, ghosts of a new kind of war. The men grew leaner, harder. They slept in vineyards and olive groves, their trucks hidden beneath camouflage nets woven with leaves and branches. They ate what they could find: hard bread, tinned meat, sometimes stolen lemons. And always the road called them onward. The circus became both rumor and lifeline, their deliveries arriving as if by magic, Ammunition in the morning, food by dusk, fuel before dawn. Commanders began referring to them in dispatches as the Phantom Supply Line. But the strain was immense. Sicily was crawling with snipers, saboteurs, and mines laid by retreating Germans. Each mile forward meant another risk. In late July, Private, the young driver who'd once written about eating the road, hit an anti-tank mine outside the town of. The explosion tore his truck apart. Henderson arrived minutes later, dust still in the air, the engine of his own vehicle rattling with stress. They found alive but pinned under twisted metal. His eyes were open, dazed, the boyish grin gone. Henderson tried to lift the wreckage, hands burning against the hot steel, but it was no use. His last words were barely audible. "Keep 'em rolling, Red." Then he was gone. For the first time in months, Henderson didn't have an answer. He stood over the wreckage as his men gathered in silence. Around them, the hills of Sicily were bright with wildflowers and gunfire. War didn't care how long a man had lasted. It took what it wanted. Henderson lit a cigarette with trembling hands and looked out toward the road. "We'll keep them rolling," he said quietly, and they did. Loss changed the tone of the circus. The laughter that had once filled the radios became rarer, sharper. The men drove with a new kind of resolve, less reckless, more solemn. They began painting a small red circle on the sides of their trucks, a tribute to and a symbol of their unit's strange defiance. The circle meant movement, continuity, the unbroken wheel that carried them forward. As the Allied advance pressed north, Henderson's methods caught the attention of higher command again, this time from the top. General George S. himself had heard the stories. He demanded to meet the man who'd managed to keep his armored divisions fueled while others ran dry. When Henderson was summoned to field headquarters near Palermo, he arrived covered in dust and oil, a stark contrast to the general's immaculate uniform. Looked him over, eyes sharp behind his polished helmet, then gestured for him to sit. "You're the one they call Red?" he asked. "Yes, sir," Henderson replied. Nodded slowly. "You've been playing hell with my logistics officers. They say you don't follow orders." Henderson didn't flinch. "Orders don't dodge bullets, sir. Drivers do." For a long moment said nothing. Then, to Henderson's surprise, he laughed, a sharp, barking laugh that broke the tension. "Good answer," he said. "Keep doing whatever it is you're doing. Just make sure my tanks never stop moving." That was all Henderson needed. From then on, the circus had unofficial immunity. They answered to no one but the mission. By early August, as Axis resistance began to crumble, Sicily became a lesson in adaptation. The circus moved faster than ever, delivering supplies through terrain so treacherous that standard convoys refused to go. They improvised bridges with planks and fuel drums, repaired roads with rubble, and used captured German motorcycles as scouts. Each journey was a blend of precision and chaos, a rolling testament to the art of improvisation. But even victory brought unease. Rumors spread that once Sicily was secured, many of the irregular units, including Red Circus, would be disbanded or absorbed into standard logistics corps. To the higher-ups, the war was moving back toward Europe proper, toward rules, structure, and predictability. The circus represented the opposite, disorder that worked too well to control. On the night of August 17, 1943, after Messina fell and the last Axis forces retreated to the Italian mainland, Henderson gathered his men in a ruined farmhouse overlooking the sea. The moon hung low over the water, silver on the waves. They sat in a circle, passing a canteen, too tired to celebrate. The air smelled of diesel and salt. Henderson looked around at the faces illuminated by the firelight men who had driven through hell and come out the other side. "We've done what they said couldn't be done," he said, "and tomorrow they'll tell us to do it their way again." He paused, letting the words settle. "But no matter what happens, wherever they send us, we know the truth. The road listens to no one. It's only ever trusted those who listen back." No one spoke for a long while after that. The fire crackled softly, the waves rolled against the distant shore, and for a rare moment there was peace. When morning came, the circus packed up and moved north again. The road awaited them, this time across the Strait of Messina, toward mainland Italy and a war that was far from over. Dawn broke over the Calabrian coast with a sky the color of gunmetal. The smoke of departing ships hung low over the Strait of Messina, turning the horizon into a gray blur where sea and sky seemed welded together. As the men of Red Circus disembarked, their boots met a different kind of earth, greener, softer, but haunted by echoes of retreat. Italy was no longer an abstract map. It was a labyrinth of valleys, mountains, and ambushes waiting behind every turn. They were tired, lean, and sunburned, their trucks from North Africa and Sicily alike. Yet their eyes still held that stubborn light, the same quiet fire that had carried them through deserts and bombed-out villages. They rolled off the ferries in staggered order, fanning out like ripples through Calabria's twisted roads. Ahead of them stretched 1,000 miles of fighting country, from the southern tip of the peninsula to the snowbound peaks north of Rome. It would be a campaign not of glory, but of endurance, a war measured not in battles won, but in the miles between them. The first thing Henderson noticed was the silence. No endless dunes, no humming heat haze. Here the air was heavy with mist and pine, and the hills seemed to swallow sound. But silence in war was never peace, it was tension waiting to snap. The Germans had turned every hillside into a fortress, every bridge into a trap. Mines littered the roads like seeds of death, and hidden artillery watched every valley. The circus had always thrived in open movement, where speed and improvisation were shields against disaster. But Italy was a strangler's country, narrow, steep, and unpredictable. What had worked in the desert wouldn't work here. Henderson knew that before the first week was out. So he adapted again. Instead of trying to outpace the danger, he learned to flow through it. He broke the unit into smaller detachments, assigning each a local guide, farmers, partisans, even children who knew the hills better than any map. These guides led them along goat paths and forgotten roads, winding through orchards and ruined monasteries. They avoided the main routes whenever possible, trading speed for invisibility. Sometimes the men would go days without seeing another Allied soldier, living off whatever food they could barter or steal. They joked that Red Circus wasn't part of the army anymore. It was a traveling ghost story. At night they drove with their lights off, engines throttled low. The headlights of Stuka dive bombers cut the sky above, searching for movement. Henderson would listen to the distant hum of their engines, judging by sound alone how close death was. More than once, he ordered a full stop in the middle of nowhere, and within minutes, bombs cratered the road ahead. The men learned to trust that uncanny instinct without question. To them, Red was no longer just a leader. He was a compass that pointed toward survival. But the further north they went, the harder the road fought back. Rains turned dust into rivers of mud, swallowing tires whole. Convoys that once raced through the desert now crawled through knee-deep muck, engines screaming under the strain. The Apennines rose like a wall across the heart of Italy, jagged and merciless. Supply lines stretched thinner with every mile, and the front lines shifted faster than they could catch up. In late September, they reached Salerno, where the landings had turned into a nightmare. The Germans had counterattacked with brutal precision, and the beachhead was a graveyard of burning trucks and twisted cranes. The air reeked of oil and cordite, and the sea was black with wreckage. Henderson's unit was ordered to bring fuel and ammunition to the front lines under constant shell fire. For 2 days they drove through hell. Artillery thundered from the hills, shells bursting across the roads in fountains of dirt and flame. Trucks overturned, caught fire, vanished into the smoke. Still, the circus kept moving, weaving between craters, pulling wrecks aside with chains and bare hands. Henderson himself drove the lead truck, window glass shattered, steering with one arm after shrapnel tore through his shoulder. When a junior officer tried to order a retreat, Red looked at him with blood in his teeth and said, "You retreat when the road does." By the third night, the supply run was complete. Against every expectation, the ammunition reached the front. Soldiers cheered when they saw the battered trucks roll in, headlights flickering through the smoke. One of the infantrymen called out, "The circus is in town," and the name stuck. To the fighting men, Red Circus wasn't just a convoy. It was a promise that someone somewhere was still keeping them alive. But the victories came at a price. The enemy learned fast. German spotters began laying traps specifically for the circus, recognizing their irregular routes and unpredictable timings. Mines were planted on side roads that no one else used, and Luftwaffe patrols shifted their sweeps to match Henderson's rhythms. It was as if the war itself had learned to listen for them. In November, near the river, tragedy struck again. A night run turned into a massacre when an ambush detonated a fuel truck in the narrow valley. The explosion lit up the hills like sunrise, and gunfire followed. Men dove for cover, returning fire with rifles meant for protection, not battle. Henderson crawled through burning debris, pulling drivers from wrecks, his uniform catching sparks. When the shooting stopped, 9 trucks were gone, 4 men dead, 3 missing. He sat alone by the river that night, staring into the black water. The reflection that stared back wasn't the brash trucker from Kansas anymore. His hair was gray at the edges, his hands burned, his eyes hollow with fatigue. He thought of all the faces he'd left behind on the road, and for the first time he wondered if he'd led his men too far beyond the edge of reason. The next morning, a messenger found him staring at the wreckage of a bridge they were meant to cross. "Orders from command," the young man said. "They're grounding you, sir. The Circus is being reassigned to depot duty until further notice." Henderson didn't reply. He just looked out at the broken span of steel hanging over the river and muttered, "The road, not finished." Within days, the Circus was pulled from active runs and stationed near Naples. Their trucks were to be used for standard supply distribution under new regulations. Everything Red had built, the freedom, the instinct, the madness, was being folded back into the bureaucracy it had. The men were furious. Henderson said nothing. He just spent his days tuning engines that would no longer move, smoking more than he slept. But even in stillness, rumor traveled faster than any convoy. Across the Italian front, stories spread of a unit that could drive through fire and shadow without losing a load. Commanders began to ask quietly, "What's Henderson doing now?" And when the push toward Monte began, one of the most brutal battles of the campaign, the answer came. The Circus was being called back to the road. As the winter rains turned Italy into a swamp of blood and mud, Red Henderson and his men once again climbed into their trucks. The engines roared to life like old friends awakened. The orders were simple: reach, deliver the supplies, and hold the line. No one said it aloud, but they all knew this might be their last road. By January of 1944, Monte was more than a mountain. It was a monument of defiance. Rising above the valley, crowned by its ancient Benedictine abbey, it loomed over the Allied advance like a ghost from another age. The Germans held the high ground in what they called the line, a chain of fortifications so formidable it seemed carved by the hand of God himself. Every road north bottlenecked beneath shadow. The town below was rubble, the rivers flooded, and every approach was under the watchful eye of German artillery. The men who fought there described it as the worst place on earth, mud thick as tar, rain falling in sheets, and the smell of death soaked deep into the soil. For months, Allied troops battered themselves against those slopes and got nothing but graves in return. Supplies couldn't get through the bombardments. Roads washed out. Bridges vanished under shell fire, trucks down in mud and cratered stone. It was a battlefield designed to break men, and it very nearly did. That's when they called in Red Circus. By then, Henderson's men were ghosts of themselves, hardened, silent. They had survived Africa's heat and Sicily's cliffs, but was something else entirely. It was cold, constant misery. They rolled out from Naples under slate-gray skis, engines groaning beneath tarpaulins soaked in rain. The mountains ahead were shrouded in fog so dense that it looked like the earth itself was smoking. Henderson led from the front, his face hollow, his hands wrapped in grease-stained bandages from frostbite and burns. Their orders were simple: keep the front supplied with food, fuel, and ammunition at all costs. The reality was anything but. German artillery watched every approach road, zeroed in by spotters hidden among the ruins. The valley floor was a graveyard of wrecked vehicles and blackened hulks. Every journey meant threading through that carnage, praying the next shell didn't have their name on it. The Circus had always thrived on motion, speed, unpredictability, improvisation, but turned those strengths against them. There was nowhere to maneuver, no cover, no way to scatter. Henderson's genius had to evolve again, and this time it wasn't about outsmarting the enemy. It was about outlasting him. He divided his men into small detachments operating around the clock. They drove mostly at night, headlights off, their paths illuminated only by flashes of artillery. They laid planks over mud pits, built makeshift bridges from blown-out buildings, even cannibalized wrecked German trucks for spare parts. They learned to move not like a convoy, but like a heartbeat, steady, pulsing, constant. Each night was a ritual of courage. The sound of engines echoed through the valley, muffled by fog, followed by the distant whine of incoming shells. The men drove through it anyway, gripping the wheel until their knuckles bled. Every delivery was a small miracle. Soldiers at the front began to recognize the sound of their engines, that deep, rhythmic growl of six-cylinder GMCs grinding through the mud, and would lift their heads, whispering, "The Circus is here." But the cost was rising. One night during a supply run up Route 6, a shell hit the second truck in the line. The explosion was so close that it blew Henderson's windshield out. He stopped, staggered through the smoke, and found the wreck burning, 2 men trapped inside. He tried to pull them free, but the fire was too hot. The last thing one of them said before the flames took him was, "Keep it moving, Red." Henderson did. He climbed back into his truck, face blackened with soot, and drove on. By dawn, the convoy had made it through. Half the trucks were damaged, one destroyed, but every crate reached the line. When the infantry saw them roll in, they didn't cheer. They just saluted in silence. That morning, Henderson didn't speak for hours. He just sat on the hood of his truck, cigarette trembling between his fingers, staring at the monastery far above, that great, unbroken crown of stone gleaming in the mist. Inside that abbey, the Germans had made their fortress. Henderson knew every shell fired at them risked destroying 1,000 years of history. The thought gnawed at him. He'd been raised on American pragmatism, get the job done no matter what. But was different. Here every road was sacred, every wall soaked in blood and faith. War had turned sanctity into strategy, and he was its unwilling servant. Then came February 15th. At dawn, the sky filled with the drone of bombers. Hundreds of B-17s and B-25s roared overhead, silver specks against a pale sky. The target, the monastery itself. Allied command believed the Germans were entrenched within its walls. Henderson stood with his men on the valley floor, watching in disbelief. They had parked their trucks in a shallow ravine, tarps drawn tight, hopping to avoid the inevitable chaos. The first bombs fell like rain. The mountain shook. Clouds of dust and fire billowed upward, blotting out the sun. For hours, the bombardment continued, wave after wave. When it ended, the abbey that had stood for 14 centuries was gone, reduced to rubble. Smoke drifted down the slopes, mixing with fog until the whole valley looked like the aftermath of the world's end. The Germans hadn't been inside the abbey before, but after that day, they moved in. The ruins gave them perfect cover, became a tomb for soldiers, for faith, for reason. Henderson's men worked through the aftermath, hauling supplies, evacuating wounded, towing broken vehicles out of rivers of mud. Days blurred into nights. Food was scarce, sleep scarcer. The rain never stopped. The circus stopped laughing altogether. Then one morning in March, Henderson collapsed. His men found him slumped over the wheel of his truck, feverish, coughing blood. The medics said it was pneumonia, maybe worse. They ordered him to the rear for treatment. Henderson refused. "You don't leave the road," he rasped. They carried him anyway. For the first time since Africa, the circus rolled without its ringmaster. The men drove on, holding to his methods, erratic routes, instinctive timing, trust in each other. It was chaos, but it worked. When Henderson woke 2 weeks later in a field hospital near, he was told the circus had completed every run. Supplies had reached the front through rain, fire, and shelling. The men had even started calling one of their alternate routes Red's Road. He smiled weakly. "They listened to the road," he whispered. By May, after months of grinding attrition, the line finally broke. The Allies surged through the ruins of past the shattered abbey and into the open valleys beyond. The road north, toward Rome, lay open. When the circus drove through what was left of, the silence was unbearable. The town was nothing but dust and bones. Henderson sat in the passenger seat of his lead truck, wrapped in a blanket, pale but alive. As they passed the wreckage of the monastery, he took off his cap. "We didn't win here," he said softly. "We just kept going." The men said nothing. They didn't need to. The engines spoke for them, low, steady, eternal. That night, as they camped outside a ruined farmhouse, Henderson wrote a single line in his notebook. "The road gives, the road takes, but it always leads forward." The circus had survived, but beyond the mountain lay the hardest miles yet, through Rome, through the Apennines, through the dying heart of a war that refused to end. And as the summer sun broke over the valley, lighting the twisted remains of trucks and stone, the circus rolled on, engines rumbling like ghosts chasing the horizon. The summer of 1944 came not as relief, but as a test of endurance. The Italian sun blazed over a land half dead from war, hills carved by shell fire, villages with bullet holes, rivers running thick with silt and oil. For the men of Red's circus, the road from to Rome was supposed to be the end of something, the final act in a campaign that had dragged on far too long. But war rarely gave clean endings. Henderson was still recovering, though recovery meant something different in wartime. His body had mended enough to walk, but his lungs burned with every breath, his hands shook when he lit his cigarettes. Yet he refused to stay behind. When the call came to move north with the advance, he was already in the driver's seat, coughing into his sleeve, grinning through the pain. "The road doesn't wait," he told his men. "Neither do we." Rome lay 100 miles ahead, but those miles might as well have been 1,000. Every bridge was blown, every pass contested, every stream turned into a quagmire. The Germans were retreating, but not surrendering. They burned the land as they fell back, roads cratered, fuel dumps torched, rails twisted into knots. The circus found themselves hauling not just supplies now. but whole armies, towing artillery through mountain passes, ferrying wounded men under sniper fire, moving civilians out of bombed villages. They became something between soldiers and saviors. By then, the circus had a reputation that reached beyond logistics. Infantry units spoke of them like a myth. "If Red's boys can make it through," one officer said, "the rest of us can damn well follow." The men painted their trucks with new insignia, a red circle crossed by a silver road, the symbol of the unbroken journey. But even legends bled. In early May, outside the town, a German rearguard ambushed one of the circus's detachments. The road was narrow, hemmed in by stone walls and olive groves. The lead truck hit an anti-tank shell that tore through its engine, setting it ablaze. The others swerved for cover, bullets pinging off metal. Henderson, in the trailing truck, ordered his men out and crawled forward under fire. He found the driver, a kid barely 20, pinned behind the wheel, his leg crushed. "Leave me, Red," the boy gasped. Henderson didn't listen. He yanked the door open, dragging him free as rounds whistled overhead. The blast of another shell threw them both into a ditch. When Henderson came to, the world was ringing and red. He couldn't hear his men calling. All he saw was the boy's face, pale in the dirt. He was gone. That night, as they buried him under an olive tree, Henderson sat alone beside the grave. "The road's getting hungry again," he muttered. It was an old trucker's phrase, one he'd used in peacetime to describe highways that claimed too many lives. Now it felt like prophecy. 2 days later, the circus was moving again, uphill, always uphill. The Allies were closing on Rome, but the last stretch was a grind through the hills, steep and narrow, where trucks stalled on hairpin turns and the air stank of gasoline and exhaustion. Henderson's convoy crawled forward in low gear, engines straining, brakes screaming. Men pushed from behind, boots sliding on gravel. Every gallon of fuel was worth a life. And then in the first week of June, the word spread down the line like electricity. Rome has fallen. The city was free. When the circus rolled in, the war momentarily paused. The streets of Rome were alive with sound, church bells, laughter, singing. Crowds poured into the avenues, waving flags, throwing flowers, kissing soldiers. Henderson's trucks came through the via like a parade of ghosts reborn into sunlight. Children climbed onto the fenders, women handed out bottles of wine, and for the first time in years, the men of the circus smiled without irony. Henderson stood atop his truck, the wind stirring the dust of the road off his jacket. He looked out over the city, the domes, the ruins, the river glinting beneath the bridges. After so much death, so many miles, it felt unreal. "We made it," one of his men said. Red nodded. "We did," he replied softly. "But the road doesn't end here, it never does." For a brief moment, they let themselves rest. They parked their trucks near the circus, fittingly enough, and slept for the first time in weeks without the sound of artillery in their dreams. The next morning, the city woke to the sight of their vehicles lined up along the ancient arena, tarps folded back, engines cooling. Locals brought bread and fruit, sharing what little they had. One old Italian farmer pressed a small wooden cross into Henderson's hand. "For the road ahead," he said in broken English. Henderson kept it in his pocket for the rest of the war. But peace in Rome was fleeting. Even as the city celebrated, the war rolled north toward Florence, toward the Gothic line, another wall of German defenses dug deep into the mountains. The circus was ordered back to work within a week. Some of the men grumbled, others just nodded. They had long since stopped asking why. The next phase of their mission wasn't about breaking lines or feeding armies. It was about keeping the machine of victory alive. Roads had to be cleared, bridges rebuilt, railheads supplied. The circus became part engineers, part soldiers, part ghosts. They worked day and night, laying down new routes across the shattered countryside. Henderson rarely slept. The doctors said the pneumonia had weakened his heart, but he ignored them. "You rest when the road does," he told one medic. Yet something inside him had shifted. The war was winning its way across the map, but Henderson no longer cared for lines or orders. What haunted him now were the faces, the drivers lost at and the boy at. Their ghosts rode with him, silent passengers on every mile. By late summer, as the Allies pushed toward the Arno River, the circus was leaner, quieter. The laughter was gone, replaced by a kind of grim peace, the peace of men who had accepted the price of their survival. They no longer looked for medals or praise, they just kept the wheels turning. Then one evening near Florence, a storm swept in, thunder rolling across the hills like artillery. The rain came in sheets, washing the dust from the trucks. Henderson stood under it, arms out, eyes closed, letting it soak through his uniform. One of his men shouted over the wind, "What are you doing, Red?" He smiled faintly, listening, the roads changing. He was right. The war was shifting, pulling north toward the Po Valley and beyond, toward the heart of Germany. The circus would follow it, as they always had, through mud, snow, and flame. But Henderson sensed that his time on the road was nearing its end. His cough had deepened. The lines on his face had carved themselves into permanence. He drove slower now, pausing longer between runs, watching the horizon as if trying to memorize it. One night, around a campfire near the Arno, he told his men a story about his first job driving grain trucks back in Kansas, long before the war. How he'd once hauled through a blizzard that shut down every road for miles, the world white and endless. "You can't see the end," he'd said, "but you keep driving because you trust the road's still there." He looked around at their faces in the firelight. "That's what this is, boys, this war, this life. You keep driving." Silence followed. The fire cracked. Somewhere in the dark, an owl called across the valley. By dawn, the storm had passed. The circus rolled out again, engines humming, rain still dripping from their hoods. Ahead lay the Po, and beyond it, the edge of the war, or so they hoped. As the trucks disappeared into the morning mist, Henderson's notebook, worn, oil-stained, and half-filled with scribbles, sat on the dashboard of his cab. The last line written there was simple. "The road never ends, it just changes its name." He didn't know it yet, but those words would outlive him. By the spring of 1945, the war was dying not suddenly, but like a fire starving for oxygen. Northern Italy lay in ruins, a landscape of broken bridges and burned towns, where every river crossing felt like the end of the world. The Germans were retreating fast now, their once-proud convoys reduced to columns of exhausted men trudging through the mud. The Allied advance rolled behind them, relentless but weary, as if victory itself were too heavy to carry. For Red Henderson and the men of his circus, it was the final road. From Rome to Bologna to the Po River, they had driven through every shade of war, from hope to despair to something beyond either. The trucks were barely holding together now, patched with sheet metal, wire, and faith. Their engines rattled like lungs that had breathed too much smoke. Henderson drove with gloves to hide the tremor in his hands, the cough in his chest deepening each day. But no one else could lead them. The road listened to him, even now. It was April when the orders came. The Germans were collapsing north of the Po. The Allied command needed one last massive push, fuel, food, ammunition, to sustain the crossing that would finally crack the enemy's line. It was the kind of mission Red had made a career out of, the kind that no one else wanted. He gathered his men under a gray morning sky, their faces thin and hollow, and spoke only once. "We started this on the road. We finish it there, too." The convoy rolled out at dawn. They followed the ancient Via Emilia, that ribbon of Roman stone that had carried armies for 2,000 years. Now it carried them 30 trucks, engines droning in grim harmony. The air was cold, the sky low, the smell of spring mixing with the reek of oil and decay. Civilians lined the roads, faces gaunt but eyes bright. They waved, some crying, some saluting. The circus waved back when they could, but their focus stayed ahead, always ahead. The Germans still fought. Retreat didn't mean surrender, not yet. Snipers haunted the high passes. Mines lay buried under puddles. In the small towns, gunfire still cracked in the distance. Every turn of the road was a gamble. But Henderson had lived his life on gambles, and somehow he always seemed to win just long enough to try again. Midway through the run, near Modena, they hit trouble. A bridge, their only crossing point over a tributary of the Po, had been blown. The span hung half-collapsed, girders twisted into the current. The engineers hadn't arrived yet, and the clock was running out. If they didn't get across before nightfall, the entire offensive could stall. The men looked to Red. He studied the wreck, hands on his hips, rain dripping from the brim of his cap. The river was swollen and fast, the far bank crawling with Allied infantry waiting for the fuel he carried. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he turned to his men and said, "We build our own damn bridge." They got to work. They stripped nearby barns for lumber, pulled planks from abandoned houses, used steel beams from wrecked trucks. In the mud and rain, they hammered and lashed and prayed. Henderson himself worked shoulder to shoulder with them, coughing blood into his sleeve when he thought no one was watching. Hours passed. The sky darkened, but by dusk they'd built a makeshift span, barely wide enough for one truck at a time. The first driver hesitated. "It won't hold," he muttered. Henderson climbed into the cab. "Then it'll hold for me," he said. He shifted into gear and drove forward. The truck creaked as it rolled onto the planks, tires slipping on wet wood. The bridge sagged, groaned, the river beneath roaring like artillery. For a heartbeat, it seemed the whole thing would collapse. Then with a lurch the truck made it across. Red looked back, a faint grin ghosting across his face. "See," he called over the radio. "Just needed a little faith." The rest followed, one by one, until all 30 trucks had crossed. When the last one rumbled over, the bridge gave way and fell into the river, gone, but only after doing its duty. The convoy roared on, headlights flickering through the rain, carrying the lifeblood of an army that refused to stop. That night they reached the forward depots on the far side of the Po. Fuel flowed, artillery fired, and the line advanced. Within days, German resistance shattered. On April 29th, word spread through the ranks, was dead. By May 2nd, the German forces in Italy surrendered. The war was over, but the road was. In the days that followed, the circus disbanded. Some went home, some stayed to help rebuild. Their trucks were reassigned, repainted, absorbed into the machinery of peace. The name Red Circus faded from the official record, replaced by dry designations and statistics. Yet among the men who'd served under him and those who'd lived because of them, the legend endured. Henderson stayed on a little longer, helping with reconstruction runs through northern Italy. The army offered him a promotion, a medal, a desk in Washington. He declined them all. "I'm no good off the road," he said simply. One evening, as spring turned to summer, he parked his truck on a ridge overlooking the Po Valley. The fields below were green again, alive with the first peace in years. The air smelled of soil, not smoke. He sat there for a long while, the sunset bleeding red and gold across the horizon. His breathing was shallow. His hands, unsteady, rested on the wheel. When one of his men came looking for him hours later, they found him still there, cap pulled low, eyes closed, a faint smile on his face. The engine had gone cold. He was gone, quietly, as if the road had finally let him rest. They buried him on that ridge, facing north. The men built a small stone marker from the rubble of a destroyed bridge and carved into it a single phrase. He kept them rolling. In the years that followed, his name became legend in the quiet corners of history, told not in medals or books, but in the way soldiers spoke of supply lines, of the men who drove through hell so others could fight another day. Commanders studying logistics would later refer to his methods as mobile staggered formation with adaptive timing. But among those who knew, it was simpler. It was just Red's way. His notebooks, recovered from his truck, were sent back to Kansas, to a sister who'd never quite understood why her brother had gone to war in the first place. Inside the final pages, she found his last words, written in shaky ink. "The road ends for no man, it just changes hands." Years later, when highways stretched across America again, truckers would sometimes talk about a phantom convoy scene at dawn, old military rigs rumbling in the mist, their engines whispering through the fog. They said if you listened closely, you could hear a voice on the wind. "Keep it moving, boys, the road's still listening." And so it was. Red Circus became more than a story of war. It was a testament to endurance, to ingenuity, to the simple courage of ordinary men doing impossible things. They didn't win their battles with bullets, but with wheels, turning, always turning, through dust, rain, and fire. Because in the end, victory isn't just taken, it's delivered. And on that long, endless road from Algiers to the Po, one trucker's ridiculous convoy method had done more than change a war. It had shown the world that even in the darkest hour, movement itself, stubborn, human, defiant, can be a kind of salvation.